The Hitchhiker's Tale. I picked up a hitchhiker, and his story still haunts me. It happened 3 years ago on a drive back from visiting my sister in Nevada. I was taking the long way home through some pretty remote stretches of highway because I wanted to clear my head after a somewhat tense family visit. It was around 10 p.m., and I hadn't seen another car for at least 40 minutes when I spotted him, a lone figure with his thumb out, standing beside a beaten-up duffel bag. Normally, I'd never pick up a hitchhiker. My dad had drilled that into me since I was old enough to drive, but something about this situation felt different. We were miles from anywhere, temperatures were dropping, and honestly, I was getting drowsy from the monotonous drive. Some company might keep me alert. I pulled over about 20 feet ahead of him. As he approached, I could see he was middle-aged, maybe early 50s, with a weathered face but well-dressed in clean jeans and a flannel shirt. Nothing about him screamed danger. "Thanks for stopping," he said as he climbed in, placing his duffel at his feet. Not many people would these days. "Where you headed?" I asked. "Just up to the junction with Route 16, if that's on your way." It was, so we set off. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was normal. He told me his name was Mike, that his car had broken down about 10 miles back, and the tow truck couldn't come until morning. But then, as we passed a particular mile marker, 117, I remember distinctly, his demeanor changed. "You ever notice anything strange about this stretch of highway?" he asked, his voice suddenly lower. I glanced at him. "Can't say I have. I don't drive this route often." "I do, every month for the past 3 years." He stared out the window, his reflection pale against the darkness outside. Started noticing patterns, things that don't make sense. I felt a creeping unease, but tried to keep my tone casual. "Like what?" "Like the fact that between mile markers 117 and 132, cell phones don't work, no service, not a single bar, every carrier." I checked my phone on the center console, no signal, but that wasn't unusual for remote highways. And how the same highway patrol car passes by every night at 11:17 p.m. Not 11:15, not 11:20, always 11:17. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:09. "And how?" he continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "I've picked up the same hitchhiker 3 times on this stretch. Same guy, same clothes, same story about a broken-down car, except I've dropped him off at that junction, watched him walk away, and then found him standing back on this same spot a month later with no recognition that we'd ever met." A chill ran down my spine. "That's weird," I managed. "You know what's weirder?" Mike looked directly at me now. "I'm not a hitchhiker. I'm a researcher. I've been studying this stretch of highway because of reports exactly like what I just described. Temporal anomalies, they call it in the scientific literature." My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "So why make up the story about being stranded?" "Because people who know what I'm really doing out here tend to have accidents." His face was dead serious. "Bad ones." The digital clock on my dashboard flipped to 11:17. Right on cue, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, a highway patrol car cresting the hill behind us. "Don't worry," Mike said calmly. "He won't pull us over. He never does. He's not really here exactly." The patrol car drew alongside us, and I caught a glimpse of the officer, an older man with a rigid expression that didn't change as he passed. He never looked our way, almost like we were invisible to him. "What the hell?" I whispered. Mike just nodded. "Between markers 117 and 132, we're experiencing time differently than the rest of the world. I've documented at least 14 instances of people encountering themselves or others who shouldn't be here. Time loops, parallel tracks running alongside each other." The patrol car vanished around a bend ahead. "I don't understand," I said, feeling disoriented. "You don't have to. Just get me to the junction, and don't come back to this stretch of highway, especially not at night." We drove the rest of the way in silence, my mind racing with questions I was afraid to ask. When we reached the junction with Route 16, Mike grabbed his duffel and opened the door. "Thanks for the ride," he said, then hesitated. "One more thing. That tow truck driver I mentioned, he's been coming to pick up the same broken-down car for 3 years now. Never finds it. Just keeps getting the same call." He shut the door and walked away into the darkness. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had happened, then made a U-turn to head back the way we'd come. It was the only way home. As I approached mile marker 132 again, my phone suddenly chimed with a series of delayed text notifications. Signal restored. I never drove that stretch of highway again. But sometimes I wonder about Mike, and whether he's still out there, still researching, or if he's somehow caught in that loop he described, endlessly hitchhiking the same 15-mile stretch of road, telling his story to driver after driver who will never remember him. Because here's the strangest part of all. When I checked later, there is no junction with any Route 16 anywhere along that highway. It doesn't exist. The vanishing car. A car that vanished on the highway. What did I just see? I work as a long-haul trucker, and I've seen plenty of strange things on America's highways, but nothing comes close to what happened last winter on I-80 through Wyoming. It was around 1 a.m. with a light snow falling, the kind that doesn't stick but catches in your headlights like you're flying through stars. Traffic was non-existent. I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least an hour when headlights appeared in my rear view. The car behind me was gaining fast, too fast for the conditions. I tensed, preparing for some idiot to fly past me doing 90, but instead the vehicle settled about 50 yards behind me, maintaining that exact distance. After 10 minutes of this, I started to get annoyed. There were 2 empty lanes beside us, yet this car just sat in my blind spot. I tapped my brakes gently, hoping they'd take the hint and pass. They didn't. The car, which I could now see was an older model sedan, maybe a Buick or something similar, just maintained that precise distance. Another 5 minutes passed, and I decided to let them pass me instead. I gradually reduced my speed from 65 to 55, then 45. The car behind me slowed too, keeping that exact same distance. Now I was getting concerned. Were they following me? Was this some kind of road rage situation developing? I'd heard stories from other truckers about being targeted. I reached for my CB radio to see if any other drivers were nearby, but there was nothing but static. My cell phone showed no service, not unusual for that stretch. What happened next is why I'm writing this down. I was approaching a gentle curve in the highway with a rock face on the right and a steep drop on the left. As I took the curve, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the headlights of the car behind me. The car didn't follow the curve. Instead, it continued straight, right off the highway and into the ravine on the left side. I saw the headlights maintain a perfectly straight line, not swerving or braking, until they simply disappeared from view over the edge. I immediately hit the brakes and pulled onto the shoulder, convinced I'd just witnessed a fatal accident. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and emergency kit and ran back to where the car had gone over. There was a guardrail there, one that had definitely been between the car and the ravine. It was completely intact, no skid marks on the road, no broken glass, no disturbed snow, nothing to indicate a car had just plunged over the side. I shone my flashlight down into the ravine anyway. It was at least a 100-foot drop, but at the bottom there was only undisturbed snow and scrub brush. No car, no headlights, nothing. I walked the guardrail for a quarter mile in both directions, thinking maybe I'd misjudged where the car had gone over. Nothing. It was as if the car had never existed. Badly shaken, I returned to my truck and called in the incident when I reached cell service an hour later. The highway patrol took my statement, but I could tell from their tone they thought I was either sleep-deprived or on something. 3 days later, on my return trip, I stopped at a diner near that same stretch of road. While paying for my meal, I noticed a bulletin board with local notices, including a missing persons flyer that made my blood run cold. It described a family of 4 who had disappeared while driving home from a ski trip in their 1996 Buick LeSabre. They were last seen getting gas about 40 miles from where I'd had my experience. The date? February 12th, 1997, exactly 25 years to the day before my encounter. I later learned from a local that this particular stretch of I-80 had been relocated in 1998 after a series of accidents. The old route, which ran parallel to the current one about half a mile away, had been abandoned and partially reclaimed by nature. That old route had no guardrail at the curve. I've driven that stretch of I-80 dozens of times since then, always during daylight, and always with one eye on my rearview mirror. I've never seen the car again. But sometimes, when the snow is falling just right, I swear I can see distant headlights in places where no road exists anymore. The roadside encounter. My roadside encounter that defied explanation. I never believed in the supernatural until 7 months ago. I'm a pharmaceutical sales rep, which means long drives between rural hospitals and doctors' offices. My territory covers 3 counties in the Midwest, with a lot of empty highway between stops. It was late September, that golden time when the cornfields have been harvested and the evenings start getting cooler. I was on my last call of the day, driving back to my hotel around sunset on a state highway I'd traveled dozens of times before. About 10 miles outside of Milton, a small town of maybe 2,000 people, I noticed someone standing by the side of the road. As I got closer, I could see it was a middle-aged woman in a light cardigan, holding what looked like a manila envelope. Something about her seemed off. She wasn't standing near a broken-down car, there were no houses nearby, and she wasn't dressed for hiking. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. She wasn't hitchhiking, she didn't have her thumb out, but she definitely looked like she needed help. I pulled over about 20 feet ahead of her. "Everything okay?" I called through my passenger window as she approached. She looked absolutely normal, short gray-streaked hair, sensible shoes, probably in her 50s. The kind of woman who'd organize a church bake sale. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, relief evident in her voice. "My son was supposed to pick me up, but he must have gotten the times mixed up. Could you possibly give me a ride into Milton? It's just up the road." There was nothing threatening about her, and it was broad daylight on a road I knew well, so I agreed. She climbed into the passenger seat, thanking me profusely. "I'm Ellen," she said as we pulled back onto the highway. "James," I replied. "So what brings you out here? It's pretty remote." She clutched the manila envelope on her lap. "Oh, just taking care of some family business. There used to be a farmhouse back there, belonged to my husband's family for generations. It's gone now, but there are still some matters to settle." I nodded, though I didn't recall ever seeing a farmhouse in that area. We drove in silence for a few minutes. Then, apropos of nothing, she said, "Do you know about the Milton vanishings?" Something in her tone made the hair on my arm stand up. "Can't say that I do. It was before my time, too," she continued, looking straight ahead at the road. "Back in 1953, 4 people disappeared over the course of 3 months, all last seen on this stretch of highway, all without a trace." "That's disturbing," I said, unsure how to respond. "What's more disturbing is that it happened again in 1983 and again in 2013. She turned to look at me. "Always 30 years apart, always 4 people, always in the fall." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You seem to know a lot about it." "Local history," she said with a small smile. "My husband was quite the amateur historian. He had a theory about it. He believed it wasn't people taking them. He thought it was this place, this specific stretch of road." "The road?" I tried to keep my tone light, but my mouth had gone dry. "He found some old Potawatomi legends about this area. They avoided it completely, called it the thin place, where the barrier between worlds grows weak." She gazed out at the passing cornfields. "Every 30 years it needs to be fed." I was starting to regret picking her up. "That's just superstition though, right?" My husband didn't think so. He spent years researching it. Said there was a pattern to who vanishes. They're always strangers to the area, people passing through, and they're always alone when they're taken, except for the last one. The 4th one is always with someone else, a witness. My palms were sweating now. I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to reach Milton. "The thing is," Ellen continued, as if discussing the weather, "the 4th one is found eventually. The others never are. The 4th one turns up days later with no memory of what happened, no memory of the person they were with." "Look, this is all very interesting, but we're here," she interrupted, pointing ahead to a sign announcing Milton's city limits. Relief flooded through me. "Where can I drop you?" "The corner of Maple and 3rd is fine. My son's house is just down the block. I pulled up to the intersection and stopped. Ellen gathered her envelope and opened the door, then paused. "This is the fourth autumn since 2013, she said quietly. September 29th, just like today. When they found my husband's car empty on this highway 10 years ago, there was a witness who reported giving a ride to a middle-aged woman. But when they found him 3 days later, he had no memory of any woman." She fixed me with a penetrating stare. "Be careful driving back tonight, James. Stay off this highway after dark." With that, she closed the door and walked away. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, then shook my head. Just a local trying to scare the out-of-towner with some creepy small-town legend. I spent an hour at a local diner, had dinner, and started the drive back to my hotel. Night had fallen completely, but I took the same highway. I wasn't going to add 40 minutes to my drive because of some spooky story. About halfway back, my car's electrical system went haywire. The lights flickered, the radio turned on by itself, cycling rapidly through stations, and then everything went dead. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder. When I tried restarting the car, nothing happened. No cell service, of course. I sat there in the dark, Ellen's story echoing in my mind. After about 20 minutes, headlights appeared behind me. A Milton police cruiser pulled up, and an officer approached with a flashlight. "Car trouble?" he asked. I explained the situation, immensely relieved to see another person. "Happens a lot on this stretch," he said. "Something about the power lines interferes with car electronics. I'll give you a ride back to town and we can get a tow truck out here in the morning." As I gathered my things to go with him, he asked, "You been out here long?" "About 20 minutes, he frowned. "And you came from Milton?" "Yeah, had dinner there. Actually, I gave a ride to a local woman earlier." "Ellen?" Gray hair, probably in her 50s. The officer's flashlight beam, which had been pointed at the ground, snapped up to my face. "Ellen who?" "I don't know her last name. She said her son lives at Maple and 3rd. He stared at me for a long moment. "There's no one named Ellen living in Milton fitting that description, and Maple doesn't intersect with 3rd. It runs parallel." My stomach dropped. "But I dropped her off there. She was just standing out here on the highway." "Sir," the officer said slowly, "I need you to come with me now. Right now." I've been back to Milton since then for work. I learned that there really were disappearances in 1953, 1983, and 2013, all in late September, all along that same stretch of highway. And in each case, the only survivor was found disoriented, with partial amnesia. The officer who picked me up that night refuses to discuss what happened. The tow truck driver who recovered my car the next day said there was nothing wrong with it. It started right up. I requested a transfer to a different territory. It was approved without question. Sometimes I try to remember more details about Ellen, but her face has grown hazy in my memory. The only thing I remember clearly is that manila envelope she carried. Just before she got out of my car, I glimpsed inside it. It was empty. The looping highway. I was stuck in a highway loop, the real-life mystery. 3 months ago, I left my friend Adam's wedding reception around midnight. The venue was in a remote area about 2 hours from my apartment, and I was dead sober, designated driver for a group that decided to stay later. The GPS showed a shortcut home that would shave 40 minutes off my drive by taking some back highways, so naturally I went for it. About half an hour into the new route, I hit a stretch of highway that seemed perfectly normal. A 2-lane road cutting through dense forest with the occasional reflective mile marker. The road was well maintained, just very, very empty. I was making good time when I noticed something odd. I just passed mile marker 41, and my GPS showed I was about to reach a junction where I'd need to turn right. But when I got there was no junction, just the same highway continuing ahead. Thinking I'd missed it somehow, I kept driving. 10 minutes later, I still hadn't seen any turn or junction. Worse, I realized I was passing mile marker 41 again. That couldn't be right. The markers should be sequential. I figured they must have duplicated numbers by mistake during some highway repair. I kept driving. Another 10 minutes, another mile marker 41. Now I was getting concerned, so I pulled over and checked my GPS. According to it, I was exactly where I had been 20 minutes ago, approaching that same junction that didn't exist. I decided to ignore the GPS and just keep heading straight. The highway had to go somewhere. After another 15 minutes of driving, I passed mile marker 41 for the fourth time. Same tree line, same curve in the road ahead, same everything. My fuel gauge showed I'd used up about the expected amount of gas for the distance I should have covered, but somehow I was making no actual progress. At this point, I was between scared and irritated. I tried calling for help, but there was no cell service. I decided to turn around and go back to the last town I'd passed through, even if it meant a much longer drive home. I made a U-turn and drove in the opposite direction. After about 10 minutes, I passed a mile marker that read 41. I was stuck in some kind of loop. Trying not to panic, I pulled over again and studied my surroundings more carefully. The forest on either side of the road looked impenetrable, but I noticed there was a narrow dirt path leading into the trees about 50 yards back. It wasn't marked and didn't look official, but it was clearly maintained enough for a vehicle. Having no better options, I turned onto this path. It was rough going, with my headlights illuminating nothing but dense woods on either side. After about 5 minutes, the path abruptly ended at a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a single wooden post with 3 metal signs attached, each pointing in a different direction. But instead of showing destinations, each sign displayed only a date: 1958, 1994, 2022. I sat there idling, completely baffled. The signs pointed toward what appeared to be identical sections of dark forest, with no paths visible. This made absolutely no sense. Then my headlights caught movement. A figure stepped out from the trees. It was an older man in what looked like a park ranger uniform, though with no clear agency identification. He approached my car slowly, and I rolled down my window. "Let me guess," he said before I could speak. "Mile marker 41? I nodded, speechless. "Yeah, happens a few times a year. You took the Shawnee Highway cutoff, right? GPS tell you it was faster?" "How did you know?" I asked. "Because that's how it gets you," he replied matter-of-factly. That junction hasn't physically existed since 1994 when they rerouted the main highway. But the old road is still there, sort of, in multiple times apparently. He gestured to the signs. "Near as I can figure, you're experiencing the road as it existed in different years simultaneously. The mile markers are the same because you're passing the same physical point, just in different decades." This sounded insane, but I was out of alternative explanations. "How do I get out?" "Follow me," he said. "I've helped folks out of here before." He walked to his truck, which I hadn't noticed parked at the edge of the clearing, and motioned for me to follow. Having no better option, I did. He led me through a complex series of turns on dirt roads that didn't appear on any map, eventually emerging onto a different paved highway. He pulled over and waited for me to catch up. "This is State Route 16, he told me through his window. "It'll take you back to the interstate. Don't take any more shortcuts tonight." Before I could thank him properly or ask any of the dozens of questions racing through my mind, he made a U-turn and disappeared back the way we'd come. I followed Route 16 to the interstate and made it home without further incident, arriving just as dawn was breaking. The whole experience had added about 3 hours to my drive. The next day, I tried researching the Shawnee Highway and the strange loop I'd experienced. I found that there had indeed been a major highway realignment in that area in 1994, abandoning several miles of the old route when a more direct path was constructed. More disturbing, I found sparse references to what locals call the Loop, a section of the old highway where people occasionally report driving for hours without making progress. Most accounts are dismissed as driver fatigue or intoxication. I also searched for information about the ranger who helped me, contacting both state and national park services in the area. Neither employed anyone matching his description, and there are no official ranger stations anywhere near that section of road. 2 weeks later, I received an unmarked envelope in my mailbox containing only a newspaper clipping from 1958. A small article about 3 motorists who went missing after taking a newly constructed highway shortcut. Their vehicles were never found. I've driven thousands of miles since that night, but I now stick religiously to main routes. And I've disabled the avoid highways option on my GPS permanently. Sometimes I wonder about that ranger and how many others he's guided out of the loop. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen to follow one of those dated signs instead of waiting for help. Miles of highway have been abandoned and forgotten across this country as newer, faster routes replace them. But sometimes I think the old roads don't forget us. The cursed rest area. This rest area seems cursed. Here's what happened. I drive for a living, not trucks or buses, but as a courier for specialized medical deliveries. Organs, tissue samples, rare medications, things that can't wait for regular shipping and need to go from point A to point B as fast as legally possible. This job means I'm on the road at all hours, in all weather, often on tight deadlines. I've seen my share of strange things, but nothing compares to what happens at Rest Area 57 on Highway 43. The first time I stopped there was purely practical. 3 a.m., bladder full, still 4 hours from my destination. It looked like any other rest area. Clean bathrooms, vending machines, picnic tables, and a large map display of the surrounding area. I noticed only two odd things on that first visit. First, despite being the middle of nowhere, 4 other cars were parked in the lot at that hour. Second, the map display had dozens of small pinpricks all over it, as if someone had repeatedly stuck thumbtacks into certain points. My second visit came 3 weeks later. Different delivery, different time of day, early afternoon, but the same rest area. This time, I paid more attention to those pinpricks on the map. They weren't random, they formed clusters around certain towns and highways. When I looked closer, I realized someone had written tiny numbers next to each pinhole, dates going back decades. As I was studying this, a heavy-set man in his 60s approached. He wore a Department of Transportation jacket and was posting a notice about upcoming road construction. "Curious about the map?" he asked. I nodded. "What are all these markings?" He glanced around as if making sure we were alone. "Accidents. Each pin represents a fatal crash within 50 miles of this rest area." "That's morbid," I replied. "Why mark them?" "Pattern recognition," he said simply. "I've worked highways for 37 years. Started noticing something back in '98. He pointed to a dense cluster of pinholes. "See these? All happened within 2 weeks after the driver stopped here. And these," he indicated another group, "all same vehicle type, all stopped here on the same day of the month, different years." I took a step back, unsure if I was dealing with a conspiracy theorist or someone with too much time on their hands. "You think this rest area causes accidents?" "Not directly," he said. "But there's a correlation, strong enough that I started warning people. Administration didn't like that, tried to transfer me, so I started keeping my own records." He tapped the map. 30 years of data doesn't lie. I thanked him and left quickly, filing the encounter under weird but harmless. But then, I started noticing things on subsequent stops. Like how my normally reliable courier van developed strange electrical problems after stopping there. Problems that disappeared once I was about 20 miles away. Or how my digital watch always showed the wrong time while I was on the property, even though it was synchronized via satellite. On my 5th visit, I arrived just as another courier was pulling out, a woman driving for a competing service. We knew each other by sight from hospital loading docks. She rolled down her window as I approached. "I wouldn't stay long if I were you," she said without preamble. "Because of the curse?" I asked, half joking. Her expression remained deadly serious. 3 years ago, I stopped here for coffee. 15 miles down the road, I fell asleep at the wheel. No warning, just suddenly unconscious. Woke up in the median with airbags deployed. Should have died. Before I could respond, she continued. 2 months later, same thing. Different time of day, perfectly rested, happened again right after stopping here. 3rd time, I didn't even make it to my car. Passed out in the bathroom. That's when I started asking questions. She told me she'd found 7 other couriers with similar experiences. Sudden unconsciousness, equipment failures, or navigational errors that nearly resulted in serious accidents, all occurring shortly after stopping at Rest Area 57. "Now I only stop here in emergencies and never for more than 3 minutes," she finished. Whatever you do, don't eat or drink anything from the vending machines. I wish I could say I dismissed all this as superstition, but over the next year, I documented my own experiences. 3 flat tires, all occurring within 30 minutes of leaving Rest Area 57, despite having new tires. GPS directions that sent me to non-existent addresses after I'd stopped there. A delivery of temperature-sensitive medication that spoiled despite my climate-controlled container maintaining the correct temperature according to its logs. Most disturbing, dashcam footage showing me stopping at the rest area for what I recall as 5 minutes, but the timestamp indicates I was there for over an hour. I have no memory of this missing time. I've since spoken with other regular drivers of that stretch. Most laugh off the curse, but enough have their own stories that it can't all be coincidence. The DOT workers' map now makes a certain terrible sense. What's happening at Rest Area 57? I don't know. The property itself looks unremarkable. County records show it was built in 1973 on what was previously empty farmland. No cemeteries, no toxic waste, no obvious explanation for the phenomena. The logical part of me says it must be something mundane, perhaps some electromagnetic anomaly affecting vehicles and electronic equipment, or maybe a natural gas leak causing drowsiness and memory issues. But that doesn't explain everything. Like the fact that accident rates within a 50-mile radius of Rest Area 57 are 37% higher than comparable stretches of highway nationwide. Or why, according to local newspaper archives, 3 different attempts to renovate or expand the rest area have been abandoned after workers reported equipment failures and inexplicable accidents. I still drive that route when assignments require it. I still occasionally use Rest Area 57 when absolutely necessary, but I follow the rules I've pieced together. Never stay longer than 5 minutes. Don't use the vending machines. Don't fall asleep. Check your vehicle thoroughly before leaving, and never ever stop there after midnight on the last day of the month. That last rule isn't mine. It came from a state trooper who refused to elaborate further. All he would say was, "That's when it's hungry." I don't know if Rest Area 57 is cursed, haunted, or simply built at the nexus of some natural phenomenon science hasn't explained yet. But I know this. Highways connect us to places we need to go, but some stops along the way connect to something else entirely. Something patient, something waiting. If you're driving Highway 43 and see signs for Rest Area 57, my advice is simple. Keep driving. Your bathroom break can wait.